From Minneapolis, Minnesota, welcome to Playwright Center's Theater Begins Here.
Welcome to Theater Begins Here, a podcast for our Playwright Center members. I'm Joyce, Director of Membership Programs, and this is
Alayna, Jacqueline, Membership Programs Manager. And as Hannah said, we are the membership team that supports our 2,400 plus playwright members around the world.
Fantastic. Well, we are so excited to have Tylie Shider with us today. Tylie is an American writer and the inaugural playwright in residence at Art Yard, a 2022-23 McKnight Fellow in Playwriting at the Playwright Center. He is a recipient of Premier Stage's Liberty Live Commission, has 2 consecutive Jerome Fellowships from the Playwright Center, and is an I Am Soul playwright in residence at the National Black Theater. Recent projects include the fall 2022 New Jersey premiere of certain aspects of conflict in the Negro family at Premier Stages, The Gospel Woman, Whittier, and his filmmaking debut, Sign o' the Times. Screenwriting credits include Truant. He holds a BA in journalism from Delaware State University and an MFA in dramatic writing from NYU. He is a proud member of the Dramatists Guild, is currently a professor of playwriting at Augsburg University, and a staff writer for Minnesota Playlist. Welcome, Tylie.
Hey, Hannah. Hey, Alayna. How you doing?
Good.
Good.
All right, so we're just going to kind of jump in, and here is our first big question. How did you get into theater?
Well, I guess it would have to start with me writing, because that's how I started. And that all starts with my father. My father is a guitarist, singer, songwriter, and I started out writing, imitating his writing habits as a kid. So I would just pick up his lyric book and just learn how to write by copying whatever he wrote. And so I started out writing songs, and then that evolved into poetry, which later evolved into short stories. And I had this obsession with magazines and media, print media, when I was growing up. I think partly because my mother owned a hair salon for like the first dozen years of my life, and I spent a lot of time organizing her magazines for her. And because I was bookish, I would read them. And so eventually I went to undergrad for journalism because I thought that that would be the professional path of my writing life. But I took this course called Modern Drama freshman year, and we studied everybody from O'Neill to Susan Laurie Parks. I think she was the contemporary writer of the moment. And after that course, I was really gripped by the form of playwriting. I think partly because it's one of the forms that encompasses all of my literary interests. So poetry, journalism, songwriting. And ever since then, I picked up a minor and I never looked back.
That's amazing. I love that. I love that it started with watching your father. That's really cool.
Yeah.
So a lot of people write, but they don't commit their lives to being a writer. What happened in your life, or was there a moment when you decided you wanted to kind of fully commit to it as a career path?
It's kind of, I guess, I don't know. I committed to it. I was like 6 or 7 years old when I was saying that I'm a writer and I want to be a professional writer. And I would practice my autograph. And I don't know what it was about that career that gripped me, but I was always attracted to the career of a writer, and I always identified as a writer very young. I just didn't know professionally how I would become a writer, whether it would be an author or a journalist, and of course, eventually a playwright, but I always identified as a writer. And I think, again, it's because my dad was a songwriter, and that's one of the activities that he did. I didn't play guitar, but that's one of the activities that he did that I actually picked up, and I just sort of preoccupied myself with that activity, and it eventually became my professional ambition after a while.
I love that you practice
Yeah.
your autograph. Do you have like copies of
Yeah.
young Tylie's autograph anywhere?
My mother probably has some, but I don't know. I got my first rejection letter at like 11 years old because I wrote a manuscript. It was my first, it wasn't a novel. Surprisingly, it was like a self-help book, but I submitted it. I picked up the yellow pages, and this is of course dating me. And I looked up publishers because I knew that that's what how authors got their work published. And I sent my manuscript. It was a handwritten manuscript that my mother let me go to the copy shop and make copies of because I wanted to keep the original one for myself. So I made a copy of the manuscript and I submitted it to a publisher. And then I got a letter that said, we're not looking for this kind of material right now at the moment.
That
And
is
so
amazing.
It was a self-help book.
I don't know why it was like a self-help book on like probably something that I saw around in my mother's library, and I was like imitating whatever I was seeing her read. But it was a self-help book about like sustaining high self-esteem or something like that. Yeah,
I love
I don't
that.
know.
That is
There was a lot
amazing.
of I did a lot of imitation when I was growing. You know, I think most writers do, but yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
But you started so early. That's so amazing. I have one follow-up question. How did it sounds like you had a lot of support at home. You know, your mother helping you to copy your manuscript and get it sent in, and your father being an artist also. How did they feel about you being a writer? Were they supportive of that?
They were and they are. I think that's one of the things that well, I'm grateful for many things, but that's one thing that I am grateful for. I'm not a first generation creative. I come from parents who are also creatives, and they prioritize their creativity and they took it seriously. And so because of that, they took their children's creativity seriously as well. So they gave us, you know, free reins to explore and decide on whatever we would like to become. But if they saw that we were interested in something creative, they certainly supported it and never gave us any doubt about whether or not we could be successful creatively. So
That's incredible.
I also want a copy of this book now.
no, it's probably terrible. It was on one of those like green papers that we would get in elementary school where the lines were like really thick lines going across. I don't even know what you call it anymore, but it was like really big handwriting.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
know exactly what you're talking about. The paper that like helps you with your penmanship.
Yeah. So obviously I was stealing a lot of paper from elementary school too, now that I think about it. Yeah, I was.
All right. So you talked about all these different influences when it comes to your writing, from music to poetry to self-help books. But looking into more private writing for yourself, do you journal? And if so, what type of journaling do you do?
I do. I've always journaled, but I've journaled as an adult now. It has been reset because when I got the I Am So residency at the National Black Theater, they gift you a 5-minute gratitude journal. And it's just something that they give to their residents. And that journal kind of got me back into it as an adult, and I've been buying a new one every time I fill it up. This is it here.
Oh, wow.
So
It's
yeah,
beautiful.
so I think this is like maybe like my sixth gratitude journal, but it's just something that helps you wake up in the morning and start your day with gratitude immediately. So, you know, you kind of reset. If you wake up and you have a big day or a heavy day or there's a lot on your mind, you can kind of start by reminding yourself of 3 things that you're grateful for. So I stick to that. Yeah.
I love that practice. What a beautiful practice. In your own writing, you sometimes tell personal autobiographical stories. Will you share with us why you share your personal stories and what that process is like for you?
I think, well, that starts at home and with my family. Some of the greatest storytellers in my life are my grandparents, and just sitting at their, I don't want to say sitting at their feet metaphorically, because I've never sat at their feet, but you know, sitting in their kitchens, sitting in their living rooms and in their backyards at cookouts, and listening to them like stand flat foot and just tell stories and, you know, hold court is something that always gripped me. And I was always more interested in what the adults were talking about than what my cousins were doing. And I just, I think I just developed this habit of holding their stories when I was younger And then eventually those are the stories that I started to tell when I started to sit down and write and think about what stories are important to me. I think I just tell the stories that I've been told, and I'm just like translating them for the stage because that's my medium, but that's really what I do. And I think because of that, because it starts with biography, when I sort of run out of stories to tell, familial stories to tell, my gaze it becomes investigative because I'm looking for more personal stories because that's where my aesthetic begins, you know?
Just knowing with personal stories is sometimes you might be at a party with people and you start telling a story and you realize, hey, you kind of had to be there. It's not as funny as you thought it was. Or like, it just doesn't land the way that you thought it was gonna be. So I always get nervous with that and like will hide myself in like a personal narrative. But how do you know that there's enough juice in a story that it has a place on stage or should be told or translated, how you said, on stage?
I think if you are gripped by it, like really gripped by it, and like some of the stories I started to tell that are biographical, I like adore the stories. I adore the people that I'm talking about, and I think if you have that sort of adoration, you could and you should expect your readers and your audience would have the same adoration that you have, and because you're going to take care of the characters in the story and that with that sort of sentiment. So I think it's something that is innate. It's something that you have to feel and know. But I also think that if a subject follows you home and it doesn't let go, there's something there. You know, I honor the gestation process. So if something is in my head, I let it sit there for as long as possible. If it goes away, then it didn't have the juice. But if it's still there 6 months later, then I think I need to sit down and pay attention to it, you know? And that was me. This is me adapting Edward Al because he said something like this before.
How do you protect yourself emotionally when you're, creating and writing work that is really personal and, might be even kind of tender or raw for you?
I don't. Maybe I
You
don't.
don't?
Well, I don't. What do you mean by that question? That's a good question.
Maybe I should rephrase it. So
Yeah.
what it is often an act of bravery, and it can be painful, I imagine, to share certain things or to relive those things. Even watching Whittier recently, like that is a charged with a lot of, trauma from so many aspects of what happened in the neighborhood and around George Floyd, and it's personal. So maybe protecting isn't the right word. Maybe it's how do you take care of yourself as you are telling stories that are deeply personal and maybe painful, and maybe even how do you kind of take care of other people who are going through the process. Like I think even about the actors who were in the room with you, who also had experienced, a lot of the violence and trauma.
Okay. Well, my background, my undergraduate education is in journalism. And I think I probably put on that investigative mentality when I approach it. So there's this objectivity that I sort of have to move forward with when I'm working on something that is as topical or as triggering as the subjects in Whittier. That's the first part. Like I have to know the difference between something that's sentimental, like me writing about my mother and her sisters, their gospel group and the gospel woman. That's sentimental. And then some things may come up that are familial that may be difficult to explore, but I sort of have familial license to explore them. So I don't really feel the same thing I may feel when I'm writing about something as universally triggering as the subjects in Whittier. So I have to approach that as a journalist. And that's why I call myself an investigative playwright, because then I start to give myself, instead of the familial license, I give myself the investigative license to go forward with objectivity to work on a particular subject. And when it comes to the people thing, I think it's less about taking care of myself and more about taking care of the subjects in the play. And if I'm taking care of the subjects in the play, I trust my work to take care of the actors in the room. And then of course, professionally, I trust that me as the playwright, I trust my collaborators that I bring in the room to also support the room and making sure that we all feel supported in the way that we're all taken care of in that space. So, Haley Finn has been a great collaborator in that regard, particularly with Whittier. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question too, that's sort of around this. You said, you have familial permission to write some of these stories. And I know that you spoke to a lot of the community when you were writing Whittier. How do you approach getting people involved where like, I'm going to tell your story? And maybe the flip side is, are there stories that you don't feel like you can tell yet because the people who, they might be about would be upset or aren't ready for it?
I'm probably not interested in stories about people who would be upset if I wrote about them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so nothing taboo from the family
Yeah.
so far.
Because I come from a show family, and
Mhm.
they've all, some of them will be upset that I said that because some of them are in ministry, and so there's a different, how that goes. But they've always been on stage. Most of my grandparents, my mom, my dad, and so that's where I feel the familial license. It's kind of like I'm taking care of stories as opposed to
Mhm.
someone else objectively telling the stories who may not have the same connection to the people that I'm writing about. So I think that trust is there. And they're just always game to participate. Like my grandfather, I sat with my grandfather at the top of 2020 before I wrote The Gospel Woman for 2 weeks, and we talked into the wee hours of the morning about the Great Migration and our family's relationship to gospel music and being sharecroppers and things like that. And he allowed me to record some of those conversations, and that led to two plays that I wrote, one set in 67 and one set in 72 about he and my grandmother moving from Georgia to New Jersey and running into the 67 riots. So, they're always down to talk about it because I think they're sharing oral history and I'm just concretizing it, Yeah.
You mentioned Haley Finn, who is our former associate artistic
I
director.
know.
Who's now, we're so happy and proud of her and excited for her now that she's moved on as artistic director of Theater
Yes.
J.
It's a lot going on.
Yeah,
going
so
on.
so many moving parts. And I always joke about Haley because Haley is always monogamous to the playwright in the room. She's just always there to support the playwright. And with the stories that you tell that are so personal, you have to have like your team. You have to have, your team is important. Your collaborators are important. And I can only assume that who you even give sneak peeks as a reader to are really important. So one, how do you choose those people to be in that space? And what are some of the challenges when telling stories that are so personal with those same collaborators?
Yes. Haley has been one. I know I've mentioned that already. It's about building tribe, I think. And I'm not I'm not a playwright who sends my plays to playwrights to read because I'm looking for someone who could give me some type of objective feedback. So I have a friend who is a fiction writer who went to Gallatin while I was at Tisch, and he reads probably everything because he's giving me feedback based on his aesthetic as a fiction writer, as opposed to another playwright. This is not to say that playwrights don't give great feedback, but as opposed to maybe another playwright giving me feedback based on how they may have written the play. It's just talking to other writers, poets, songwriters, and letting them read and give me feedback. So I start with that. Who am I giving it to in terms of craft? And then I like to give it to an actor because I think actors have a different eye. And they read it and they give me things like, I wouldn't want to do this, or I love this character, et cetera, or, this is the best play I've read about you, Tylie. I had one of my actor friends say that. And I was like, this is like the sixth play you read about me, bro. I don't know how I feel about that. But they saw themselves in it, like, oh, I would love to play this role. So I start pulling together a team, even when I'm curating who's going to read it, So director, actors, and I try not to stay on that same playing field of just sending it to other playwrights, because I think then the feedback can become kind of flat. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question at all. That may be the one that I kind of dodged.
No, I think that you did. There were a lot of moving parts in that question. So I think you did. I mean, has there ever been any challenges that come with that's personal, or these are just people that you always trust, or else you wouldn't give it to them?
Yeah, I've built trust with them, and I've read their stuff, or you kind of know who to give something to, you know. And I'm not afraid of giving something to somebody who I think may give me pushback either, because I like to get that stuff done before it goes public, you know. So that's why sometimes by the time I get to a reading and a talk back, I've already heard some of the things I'm going to hear from an audience member because I've sent it around and, you know, gotten a diversity of feedback.
I do have a quick follow-up because I like to know this about every writer in any genre. What type of writer are you in a talkback session? Are you the I'm wearing glasses so nobody sees what my face is doing? Are like sunglasses in a theater? Are you somebody that's like, I'm going to turn my back to the audience? Are you like fully engaged with people? What type of writer are you?
My back is not to, could you imagine my back being to the audience? No. I might have to try that one out. No, I'm the one who, like you said earlier, I put together a strong team to sort of support me in that space. And I do a great deal of listening at talkbacks. But by the time I get to the stage to kind of participate in a talkback, I've already done the work of studying an audience while the play is happening. I probably have about 80% of what I need from the audience already. I just like to listen to them talk and sometimes validate some of the things I've already picked up from their physicality or the noises that they're making or not making, or the three people who walked out and why. So, you know, you can learn a lot just from watching your audience. That's like, I think it's a masterclass. You know, and that's one thing I don't think we did enough in graduate school was, although I love Tish, we didn't get an opportunity to watch audiences just hear our plays over. I think we should have done that every semester because that's a master class, even if it was just the undergrads coming to hear our work, you know. Thank God for the Playwright Center, because we don't shy away from that at all.
Yeah, sitting all the way in the back and watch everybody.
Yeah, right.
Do you ever take creative license when you're writing a story that is about, you know, your experience or your family's experience? And, you know, if so, what compels you to do that? Is it around like leaning into a theme or giving a character an opportunity to make a choice you didn't make?
It's usually more about framing it, because, you know, it's those oral history is big, and it's not, sometimes it's being told from 7 different perspectives, and then the goal there is, if there's not 7 characters in the play, the goal there is to just distill it. So, like, you know, in the Gospel Woman, my mother and her sisters, there were 4 of them. They sung together all of their lives. But in the Gospel Woman, there's just 2 sisters. So I had to create some composites there, you know, so it becomes about framing, it becomes about craft. And that's where the creative license comes in. You know, is this going to be a family drama? Is it going to be a 2-hander? Those choices sort of start to shape the piece and make it what it becomes. That's not in a direct reflection of the oral history or the people that I may be pulling from. Although they know it when they see it, even if it's
right, a little bit different. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot about personal stories and personal narratives. What is the difference in your approach to writing a personal story that comes from a root of truth versus something that is completely imagined and taken away from what you know and what you've experienced?
I think it's all imagination, and I think we're all trying to get to a truth. Even when I'm listening to my grandfather retell stories, I think in translation, truth becomes imaginative to an extent. But even in that imaginative translation, he's still seeking a truth, you know. But it's like he's talking about 6 decades ago, and then there's a little bit of an embellishment. And he's a performer, so it gets, you know, it's masterful. But I think that playwrights are doing the same thing. I think we're doing the same thing.
This is just like a curiosity that has nothing to do with writing or your oral history, but in a family of, I also have a lot of storytellers in my family, and over the years you hear the same story over and over again, but it kind of sometimes changes, or as you said, the embellishment. Do you notice that in your family too?
My mother can take the smallest incident and you just be like, you're just sitting there like, what happened? And it's just it's an embellishment. But I told her, like I said, I feel like I may have taken your career, because I feel like the way she retells a story, and it's just the dramatics of it, and it's like you're really setting up a conflict, and sometimes you're like, I don't know if that's exactly what. Okay, all right, Ma.
I love it. How do you tell other people's stories if you didn't experience them? It sounds like you've heard your family tell the stories of your family for years and years, and now you've kind of moved beyond your family and you're out in your community. What is is it the same process, or is it a different process for you when you're telling other people's stories, and what's that like for you?
The subjects are different. The process is the same, I think, because the heart is the same. And I think that is what gets people to open up to me, because my heart is the same for the stories, because I practice that sort of interest, that sort of genuine interest in other people's stories. That started at home. So I think when I sit down with someone who may or may not be my family member, they can see my heart, and not just like, oh, the intellectual journalist part of it all, but they're like, oh, this guy is really going to take care of my story. And I think that's just something that I hope people can just feel. So I think the heart is the same.
What advice do you have for others that are writing their own personal stories?
I say trust it, and maybe get out of your way. I know I didn't really know that exploring biography was so difficult until I got to graduate school. And I'll say I had a friend, a really good friend, we're still friends, who was struggling with writing biography. And I didn't understand that. And I know she would say, like, like, that's your thing. You're really bold about that, to just explore your family's, biography. And I didn't even think it was a bold thing at all. But until I met her and realized that she was struggling with it. But I think, I guess I feel like, okay, Marsha Norman says, and whenever I'm teaching playwriting, I always tell students Marsha Norman's quote, which is to tell the stories that won't get told if you don't tell them. So I feel like if you look at it less as if it's not like you're like exploiting them, but you're concretizing their stories, and you're like ensuring that they will always be remembered. Even if it's just for the next generation in your family to remember those stories. That's the purpose of oral history. And you, as a playwright, that just may be your purpose in your family, to concretize this. No one else is doing it. Like, if you look around, you don't have like 6 other cousins that's doing what you're doing. So it's just, it may be your primitive purpose to concretize the oral history in your family. Look at it that way. That's my advice.
I love that. That's a soundbite right there. We have a submitted question, and I also want to let folks who are joining us on the webinar to have an opportunity to put any questions they might have in the chat. We can read the submitted question first and give any other live attendees an opportunity to chat here. The question we had that was submitted was, how do you approach a personal story that you have unresolved feelings around, or if you don't feel you've lived the ending of the story yet?
I don't. And I'll give an example. Six months ago, my wife and I divorced. It was a relatively amicable divorce. We had a good run, but we grew apart. And I have a close friend who knew that was happening in my life, and he's a director and a producer in New York, and he's working on a TV series about young married couples. And he thought I'd be great for it because my marriage, I'm paraphrasing, because my marriage was falling apart. And I'm like, bro, this is not the time for me to do, like, what do you think? Why do you think this will be therapeutic for you, and you have so much to say about being young and married, you got married young, etc. And I'm like, this is not the time. I don't really go to my work for therapy. Like, I go to escape, I go to invent, I go to concretize. I don't go to like, and not that this is negative, I don't go to, like, journal about, it's not my journal. My plays are not my journal. So I don't think, and here's why, I don't think that I'd have enough distance to look at it objectively and really build something plausible to ask an audience to sit and listen to. Me rant about my my feelings that may change in the next 6 months. So I think just giving yourself time to sort of get the necessary distance to really write about something objectively and something that will become substantial and actually be plausible. So I think time is okay. It's okay to give yourself time. Yeah.
I have one other question, and I'm not sure. It sort of falls in line with this, and it's also kind of another topic that maybe we'll talk about later. But you are, you interview folks, you go into community, you write about stories that you are part of, maybe not full, like maybe more of the story is about other people's experiences. How do you do that in a responsible way so that you are not creating harm or taking on stories that aren't yours to tell? Like, how do you kind of navigate these dynamics, these very complicated dynamics?
I don't know. I think I think that's the two heads going. I think when I think as an investigative playwright, I think as soon as I add that part on to what I'm doing, I don't think I move with that sort of sensitivity of, am I telling someone stories that's not mine? I don't think I really have that sensitivity because I started out as a journalist. So if it's happening around me, then I feel compelled, if I'm gripped by it. That's where the playwriting thing comes in, because I'm choosing what stories to concretize. Whereas a journalist, I may have assignments to go and tell stories I don't even want to tell. But I think the playwriting aspect gives me an opportunity to just choose those stories. And I think because I choose them with heart, and I usually choose the stories that are choosing me. So I don't really, if you're not connected to that spiritual practice, that's like my spiritual practice too. Like if you're not connected to that part of you, then you may stumble upon a story that isn't yours to tell because you're not really listening to yourself. I listen to myself and I tell the stories that are calling me.
Thank you for that. We got a question from the audience. Thanks, Nubia.
Is that Nubia?
Yes, Nubia is hanging with us today. Yes. So Nubia asks, from your head to the page to the stage, what's your process as the writer? And do you ever feel like you could direct your own work since it's so personal?
I started out directing my first play. I directed myself. So yes, I would direct my work. I'm not interested in doing so at all now. I like to give myself more freedom. And I think you gain something when you bring in the objectivity of a director that I'm not willing to give that up as of now. My process as a writer, I start with a very nuanced blueprint that is eventually becomes my first draft. That's how many pages I amass after a while. And that's like my notes and my outline on themes and characters and relationships, conflict, et cetera, scenes. It's very detailed. And then I just plug that into the playwriting format, and that becomes my second draft. And in plugging that into the playwriting format, things change and things start to come together. And then I would just print it off the computer, and then I read it, because I think once you read it on paper, something changes and you notice things differently. And then I do some annotation, and then that becomes a third draft once I plug in those annotations. Once that third draft is done, I think it's ready to be sent out to like those readers I was talking about earlier, and then move on professionally. But those are kind of like the first three drafts that I do. So by the time my readers get the first draft, it's like a fourth draft. I don't know if you get that, Nubia?
That makes me think about how, I don't know if you've ever seen the show Bible for The Wire.
Yeah, I have.
And
yeah.
like how they're journalists, and that's basically all the show Bible is just like profiles on them. So I just kind of imagine you more as a like detective and the crime wall in the background with the characters. Yeah, that's how I imagine like what your home office or like space would look like.
I'm reporting to the American Theater.
Amazing. Well, we are at our favorite part of the podcast. This is the moment where we ask you where theater begins for you. And we all say, we take turns saying theater begins, ... fill in the blank. Tylie, would you like to begin and say where theater begins for you first?
Yes, my first play was about my dad and his brothers and his sister and their relationship to their father. My father's father passed away when I was 1 year old. So I always knew my dad to be a young fatherless son. So I wanted to explore that in my first play in undergrad. So obviously theater for me starts with biography.
It's beautiful. Alayna, do you want to go next?
I have so many Post-its. I'm trying to get them together to make one thought. Because Tylie said so many great things. But I think I have it together. Theater begins with taking care of the stories that don't let you go with gratitude and adoration.
Ooh, you said all that, Tylie, and Alayna just made a beautiful statement out of it.
Come on, Streamline.
Well, I'll end with theater begins with listening to your family's stories. I love this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us, Tylie. This was a delight.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. That's so cliche, but I'm happy to be here.
So glad. Yay. Yes, our first season.
Thanks for listening to Playwright Center's Theater Begins Here.